vCenter server, and especially the web client, is something that a lot of people started looking into recently. With 5.0 introduced.
In 5.1 Autojoy, you also have the opportunity to even get an image on your local disk.
Yeah.
So if everything is good, you can even start up your these extra I hosts from local disk.
Yeah, that's a good comment. So with 5.1, what we introduced is what we call stateless caching. And basically what it does, it caches an image on local storage, but it also means you need to have local storage. So in a way, it also kind of defeats the whole purpose of the solution. And now there's still some dependencies here and there. So although it solves the particular problem, it doesn't solve the full solution, it doesn't solve the full problem that there is around availability. So that's why I'm saying if you start looking into scenarios like these, test them. Because I'm pretty sure you're going to hit a bottleneck and you figure out, well, USB or even boot from SAM makes a lot more sense in this case. Now, when we start talking about vCenter server, the one thing that's important to realize is that from a scalability perspective, sizing perspective, there are limits when it comes to the amount of virtual machines that vCenter can run on, or you can run in a single vCenter instance. And then there is the PDF which shows you the amount of virtual machines that theoretically you can run on a single vCenter host, or at least manage via a single vCenter host. And it says, I don't know, 10,000 at the moment, 20,000, whatever it is. I can tell you, you will never hit that limit in your environment. Because before you reach that limit, you'll start having performance issue with your vCenter server. Around 4,000 or 5,000 VMs. Typically the amount of CPU resources needed to figure out the virtual machines need to be placed, the amount of tasks that are spawned every second, just to figure out, for instance, by DRS, where virtual machines need to be moved through. It just takes up too many resources, so that's the point where you start looking into having a second vCenter server. I just mentioned the web client. Hopefully everyone started looking into using the web client, because the web client, from a VMware perspective, is the way forward. Now, has no one else realized that it kind of feels clumsy when you start using it. It always feels like every single task takes at least twice the amount of time you used to take with the regular client. But that's something you get used to, I promise you that. Once again, the web client is the future. Now the nice thing about the web client is it's a scale-out model. So you can have multiple web client servers up and running, and have load balancers sitting in front of it. So one of the appliances fails, there's always another one running. Now I just mentioned the appliance. People using the appliance actively. So I use it in my lab. The reason I use the appliance by itself is because it's really, you can set it up fairly quickly. Now the downside of the appliance is it's limited to 50 virtual machines and 5 hosts. That's a testing limit. So it's not a hard limit. You can have 20 hosts, you can have 40 hosts, you can have 5,000 virtual machines. It will just keep on running. So just for your information, the VMworld Labs, which handles 30, 40, 50,000 new virtual machines in just a couple of days, they were using the vCenter appliance. So though the testing limit currently says 5 hosts and 50 VMs, it's still a viable option if you ask me. But this is something that we're going to change in one of the upcoming releases. So from a scalability perspective, the appliance will also be changed. So we'll be supporting more hosts and more virtual machines that at least most of you guys will be able to use it in your environment.
We also support a Fleet Manager.
That's a good question. And it's a difficult one to answer. And the reason for that is we're looking into other solutions around update management as well. That's about all I can say, because people will fire me if I give you more information. But there are multiple things going on within VMware. I don't know if anyone is doing the beta program that we are hosting currently. There's multiple beta programs going on. There's going to be something similar next year, and Update Manager is going to change. But essentially, the new version will be part of the appliance itself. So we'll make sure that you can have an appliance-based infrastructure, if you desire. So on top of that, we also make sure, of course, that you can still use it on Windows or any other platform. So I already briefly mentioned this. The data center object is one of the key things, if you ask me. Reason for it being is it's a boundary for some of the functionality. Like I said, vMotion and, for instance, DBS, so the distributed vSwitch. So a lot of people assume that the cluster is actually a boundary, but a cluster isn't a boundary for anything. It's the data center level. So you can have multiple clusters within the data center and move virtual machines around between clusters if you desire. So then the next question pops up. Why would I have multiple clusters? Can I have a single cluster? Can I have multiple clusters? Well, it kind of depends on the use case. What will the environment look like? Will I have a specific DMZ that needs to be physically isolated, for instance? I've seen those out in the field. Will I be doing server virtualization, but also VDI? Well, VDI typically is installed on a separate cluster because of the type of workload. It's completely different than server workload, and it might interfere with your server workload. So you would have a dedicated cluster for that. Are you, for instance, doing a vCloud Director? You might want to use a dedicated cluster for that as well, because vCloud Director more or less manages a cluster and creates new resource pools. And you don't want to have 2,000 new resource pools in your production cluster and not really knowing what they are doing. So those are the kind of things that you need to take into consideration. Now on top of that, there's functionality like HA, FT, DRS, and DPM within a cluster. So we're giving away, the VMUG guys are giving away 3 books, which are primarily around HA and DPM and DRS. I won't go into extreme amount of level of depth. But one of the things to realize is when people did designs in 4.1, is they always stuck to an 8-node cluster, so 8 hosts in a cluster. With 5.0 and 5.1, that's not needed anymore. So if you have 16 hosts, you can easily have them in a single cluster. The reason we used to have that 8-host limit was because of the way HA handled restarts. So we're using primary and secondary nodes, and we always needed to have a primary node available to ensure we could restart a virtual machines, or we could restart virtual machines. With the new version of HA, that's not relevant anymore. We use this new concept, which is called master-slave. There's only one master in the cluster, and if that host fails, one of the slave nodes will pick up. So you don't need to worry about it anymore. Of course, you will still need to worry about availability from a location perspective. You might want to make sure your hosts are spread across multiple racks or multiple blade chassis, of course. Because if they're all in a single blade chassis and that chassis fails, they're all gone. So as I said, from a cluster size perspective, it's a typical question I get, what's a good cluster size? Well, it depends on the amount of hosts you have and your use case. Could be 6, could be 8, could be 32. I have customers who do 24-node clusters. It's a perfectly viable option. The second thing, will you be using resource pools? So how many people are using resource pools? So the next question then arises, how do you handle things like reservations, limits, shares? Are you doing anything with that? If you're not, I can highly recommend to read Frank Denneman's blog articles about shares, limits, and reservations. And the reason why is, if you're not handling those the correct way, you could end up with, for instance, a resource pool which is labeled as high with 500 virtual machines, and a resource pool which is labeled as low with 50 virtual machines. And those 50 virtual machines end up with more resources than the virtual machines in the pool of high, and just because of the way the shares mechanism works. So make sure you take that into consideration when you do your design. So the last topic I will touch.
Excuse me. Best practice is to have a management cluster. What's the size good for a management cluster for you?
Yeah, so
I think 3, but...
Yeah, so the question is, the best practice is to have a management cluster for an environment, and what is the typical size you would have for a management cluster? Now, first of all, if you ask me, there is no real best practice around having a management cluster. There is a scenario where it makes sense. So as soon as you have, let's say, 500, 1,000 virtual machines, you have 10, 15, 20 hosts, the bigger your environment gets, the more important uptime of a vCenter will be, because managing your virtual machines is part of your core business at that point. In small environments, it's perfectly viable option just to have 3 or 4 nodes and have vCenter servers sitting up on one of those nodes. Now, in larger environments, it is indeed typically recommended to have a management cluster, and 3 nodes is what I would start off with. Because if one of them fails, at least have 2 up and running. And then if a second issue occurs, which normally happens, right, at least there's still 1 node left and your management platform is still around. So 3 would be a good option.
And what about admission control and management cluster?
So admission control?
Yeah.
So admission control is an easy topic for me. So with HA, you configure vSphere HA, you have 3 different types of admission control. So you have the host failures, the amount of host failures, and you can set those from 1 to 31 with 5.0. Or you have the percentage based, or you have the designated failover host. Now my option, percentage based, is the best option to use. The reason for it being is it's the most flexible option. If you start using reservations, you will soon figure out why it's the most flexible option, because it determines the amount of resources that are used based on a per virtual machine basis. With the host failures does it based on the largest reservation set. So, which means that if you have one reservation set of 16 gigs, that's going to determine the amount of virtual machines you can run in a single environment. So, percentage based is, in my opinion, the way to go. Now, before I need to wrap up, storage, and I know Cormac is going to talk about storage for about 30 minutes, so he's going to handle a lot of these things, in my opinion. So one of the things that's important to realize as soon as you start doing your design is, for instance, is your storage system VAI capable? Is there a VASA plugin? So what is VAI? VAI is a way of offloading specific tasks to your storage array. Scott spoke about offloading specific networking tasks to your network controllers. Storage at the moment does something similar with VAI. So for instance, a clone, you can upload that to the storage array. That is, if your storage array supports that. Now you will notice, when your storage array doesn't support it, a clone might take 30 minutes or 40 minutes. When your storage array at least has a smart way of implementing VAI, sometimes it takes 30 seconds just to clone a virtual machine, which is 500 gigs large, for instance. Or when you create a thick disk, or an Eager0 thick disk, I don't know if people use Eager0 thick disk for performance reasons. I use it on some of the databases. If you create an Eager0 thick disk on an array that doesn't support VAI, it's going to write zeros to every single block. And that takes a lot of time when you have a 500 gig disk or a terabyte disk. With VAI, basically you tell the storage array to handle that for you. So creating a thick disk, Eager0 thick disk, takes a split second. Of course, again, depending on the way the storage vendor implemented it. And this is also something that you will need to discuss with your storage vendor, if you ask me. Yeah, I think it's time to wrap up now. I want to thank everyone for attending the session. If there are any questions, feel free to come up. Yeah, Mike, I know you'll have questions. He always does. But feel free to come up, after the session itself, or during the show. I'll be walking around attending some of the other sessions, so feel free. Thanks, everyone.